one of the things I'm finding with the podcast is when I do these posts, these Q&A posts, people are a lot more inclined to message privately their questions, whether it's they prefer being de-identified, but particularly on this topic, which I can understand. Now, there was a few questions that come up. One you received, Sam, via your Instagram messenger, I think. And it was about how do you feel about the mind and body, the role of stress and how this impacts fueling pre-race and insulin adjustments once the race starts, levels kind of hit the floor and you're quite low. How do you manage that on race day?
Yeah, we kind of briefly touched on it before, like as an example. Yeah, in this question, they were asking about like what effect does the mind have on the body, and I kind of said like I'm not a psychologist, but it's very clear to see that if you're nervous before racing, or in other aspects of life, then your blood glucose can rise extremely high, and as I said, we see examples where before big races, some athletes would have glucose well above 20 millimole. And then how you deal with that is a big decision that you have to make. I guess in terms of managing that, it's down to like experience, trying to manage the stress. Maybe you've got to focus more on on controlling your emotions or managing your emotions, because the risk of underfueling before the race because you can't fuel more, otherwise your glucose goes even higher, combined with, on the other hand, if you take insulin before the race because you want to lower that stress-induced glucose spike, you then risk a hypo as soon as you start the race. So maybe we've got to work much more on helping people to develop those kind of strategies for coping with stress.
Do you have anything you wanted to add there, Drew?
Yeah, no, I think that's really good advice. I also think that perhaps we put too much emphasis on the like perfect insulin strategy, and if I don't eat my carbs at this time, then I'm not going to be a good athlete or perform right. But really coming back to that mental piece, some of my best performances have been under circumstances where my blood glucose was not perfect and my insulin strategy or timing wasn't perfect. And I had this idea of how I wanted my event to go, or even just a gym workout. And through some mental resilience was able to sort of combat that and have one of the better workouts or better performances. And an example was I was competing on Ninja Warrior, and my blood glucose was obviously extremely high because I was so nervous, and it was 1 o'clock in the morning when I was performing my event, and I still performed really well and I was really happy with it. So I think that we shouldn't put too much on these numbers and these sort of data-driven approaches, and also go by feel and go by how mentally strong are you and what are you capable of, because oftentimes you can get around these things just with a strong mind.
Yeah, and so the next question we had, well, there's a couple of parts to this question. This came from a course I did for Exercise and Sports Science Australia webinar that I delivered last year on type 1 diabetes. And one gentleman from Melbourne sent me some private messages in relation to some of the considerations around insulin, but also in regards to ketones in the blood. So he asked, if someone continues to hypo following exercise, are we allowed to suggest reducing insulin? How much freedom does the medical team give the person to alter their insulin? So when he says we, he means us as exercise physiologists. So how much freedom does the medical team give the person, or us as the exercise physiologist, control to alter their insulin? Kind of like what you were talking about before, Drew, with the Novo Nordisk team. Should we write to the GP or diabetes educator rather than suggesting ourselves? So I think we kind of addressed this one as well before, but do you want to provide your 2 cents on that again, Sam, Drew?
Well, I think Drew is more qualified to answer this because you're diabetes educator, but yeah, they need to be speaking to somebody who's qualified to give the advice on that. I don't think just an exercise physiologist is qualified to do that. It's like a diabetes educator or an endocrinologist or a diabetes nurse. But it's the individual living with diabetes at the end of the day who's making the decisions about what to do, and they can decide what they have to take in terms of the advice.
Exactly. Yeah, I think just for the record, I'm not currently credentialed. I've graduated as I've got my degree in diabetes education, but I'm not practicing for a few other reasons that we can talk about. But what I'd say to people is, number one, if hypos is the reason you're going to adjust your insulin, it's a pretty good idea to do that, in terms of like, if you find that you're going low, you have too much insulin on board. As an exercise physiologist, I'm comfortable to recommend for somebody living with type 1 diabetes to probably reduce their insulin if they feel like they're constantly going low from exercise related reasons for having hypos. I'm pretty comfortable to say, it seems like you have too much insulin on board. You can either eat more carbohydrates to keep your blood glucose higher, or you can reduce your insulin dosages. And my recommendations would be XYZ. Take this to your diabetes educator and your endocrinologist and talk to them about this sort of plan and see how they feel about it. I think you've got to keep the whole team in the loop. I don't think it's a good idea to go behind anyone's back and say, don't listen to this person, here's my strategy, or vice versa. I think if everyone's just honest and open, you're going to have way better outcomes. But I think, like, short term, if they're going low from exercise and it's happening frequently and it's happening up, for many weeks, it's okay to suggest a strategy that involves lower insulin doses. Again, just double cross it across your whole team. I think that's important to do.
Awesome. And so the second part of the question, if someone comes in with hyperglycemia, glucose levels above 15 millimole per liter, and we need to test for ketones, do most individuals with type 1 diabetes carry ketone strips? What if they don't? Do you stock these strips when exercising someone living with type 1 diabetes as the exercise physiologist? If they have ketones above 1.5 millimole per liter, when is it safe to exercise again? And what is your procedure when they have high blood ketones above that 1.6 millimole per liter? So they're going through diabetes ketoacidosis. What would be your suggestion in that response, Sam? I know it's quite a long-winded answer though, so if you need me to go through certain points.
Yeah, just I wonder, just maybe this is like cut from the thing, but I wonder how much detail you want to go into. This is quite a specific question that's kind of,
as an exercise physiologist, do we need to stock ketone test strips? Is it the responsibility of the health practitioner, or is it the responsibility of the individual living with diabetes? And then the second part to that would just be around the safety around exercise. When you would terminate exercise, what's safe, what's not?
Yeah, well, ketoacidosis is extremely dangerous, and it's definitely recommended that people carry ketone strips, and if they have higher glucose levels, that they're testing to ensure that there aren't ketones. In terms of exercise, there's different kind of protocols for when is safe to start exercising in general. So if you have a high glucose, generally above like 14 millimoles, something like that, you might consider checking your ketones, giving yourself a bit of insulin, waiting a bit before starting exercise. Yeah, depends how high you are, making sure you're well hydrated, just keeping an eye on it, and just keep monitoring.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Having ketone strips, a lot of people don't have them. I can tell you now, I definitely don't have any on me. I know that if my blood glucose is high, we've got a couple of options. Number one is administer insulin and wait for the blood glucose to come down, and or use a low intensity form of exercise to help bring the blood glucose down into range. So if you're high, you're just adding fuel to the fire if you start a high intensity workout. So maybe that's a time where you say, you know what, I'm going to do something a little bit more gentle. Maybe I go for just a slow walk, a brisk walk. Maybe I pair that brisk walk with a little bit of insulin. So it helps to sort of activate that insulin maybe a bit quicker, rather than just giving the insulin, sitting down for 20 minutes and hoping it comes into range. It could be that you just give a very small dose, use that low intensity or moderate intensity exercise to activate the insulin to help you bring that blood glucose down into a normal range. And then at that point, you might even need to eat carbohydrates to avoid going too low, which can also help to reduce the ketones in your bloodstream as well.
Yeah, awesome responses, guys. And I think it would also be useful for the listeners. I know we probably should have unpacked this before the actual question was answered, but what actually is diabetes ketoacidosis in as simple terms as you can explain? Probably Drew, do you want to take this one, mate?
Yeah, I mean, put simply, most people would find out they have diabetic ketoacidosis in the worst possible way, which is when you're diagnosed, or if you're undiagnosed. Initially, you have diabetes without even knowing it. Essentially, your blood glucose is so high for so long that your body starts to find other ways to fuel the cells in the brain, and it starts to produce ketones, which in the bloodstream, if they get too high, can have this, acidic effect, which can put your whole physiology and metabolism into disarray. So you want to avoid it. And where it gets a little bit tricky, and this is probably another podcast altogether, is when people are intentionally trying to be in a state of ketosis as somebody living with diabetes. That's when you can start to, I guess, use ketones as a tool in some ways to keep your blood glucose in range. So you become a better, say, fat burner, and you're using ketones more rather than glucose. But when you start to get to ketone levels that are ketoacidotic, that's when it becomes a problem. So it's small amounts of ketones in the blood can be okay, even if you have diabetes, even if you have type 1 diabetes, but it's knowing those limits and when to sort of lean on the insulin and start to eat carbohydrates again that becomes really important.